The ribbon was already stretched across the entrance when Sheriff Daniel Mercer stepped forward, looped a heavy steel chain through the Marina gate, and snapped a weathered padlock shut with a sound loud enough to silence more than 200 people gathered for the grand opening. The jazz trio stopped playing in the middle of a song. Champagne glasses froze halfway to smiling faces. A row of brand-new pontoon boats floated quietly against polished cedar docks that had never welcomed a single paying customer. Across the parking lot, television crews lowered their cameras while contractors wearing bright orange safety vests stared at one another, suddenly unsure whether they should pack their equipment or pretend none of this was happening. Standing beneath a banner that read, Silver Cove Community Marina Grand Opening, Vanessa Holloway, president of the HOA, still wore the confident smile she had practiced for weeks. She adjusted the white blazer draped neatly over her shoulders, lifted a leather folder toward the sheriff, and spoke loudly enough for every resident to hear. There has to be some misunderstanding, Sheriff. This marina belongs to Silver Cove Estates. Sheriff Mercer never raised his voice. He simply looked at the folder in his hands instead of hers. Ma'am, he replied calmly. My office has been instructed to suspend all public access until ownership of this property is resolved. The words settled over the crowd like a sudden storm cloud. Homeowners began whispering. Several families who had already paid thousands of dollars for annual boat slips exchanged confused looks. One elderly couple quietly folded the community maps they had picked up moments earlier. Behind the sheriff, two deputies moved portable barricades across the only entrance road leading to the docks. They worked without hurry, the way experienced deputies always do when paperwork has already decided the outcome. I remained where I had been standing since sunrise, leaning against the old split-rail fence overlooking my lake. I didn't wave. I didn't argue. I didn't even step toward the gate. That seemed to bother Vanessa far more than if I had shouted. She spotted me across the gravel lot and pointed in my direction. This is because of him, she announced. He's been trying to interfere with this project for months. Several people turned toward me, expecting an angry landowner ready to start a fight. Instead, I simply took another sip of coffee from the old thermos my late father used to carry during early mornings on this shoreline. The lake behind the marina reflected the clear blue sky as if nothing unusual were happening. It had looked exactly the same long before luxury homes appeared along its banks, long before the HOA existed, and long before anyone decided my family's water could become somebody else's business opportunity. Sheriff Mercer accepted another envelope from a woman in a Navy business suit who had just arrived beside a county vehicle. My attorney, Clara Bennett, gave me a brief nod before handing the sheriff one final document. He opened it, studied the first page for only a few seconds, then looked back toward Vanessa. Her smile disappeared for the first time that morning. She still believed this was nothing more than a delay. She had no idea that the single sheet now resting inside the sheriff's hands answered the one question nobody in Silver Cove had ever bothered to ask: who actually owned the lakebed beneath their brand-new $3 million marina? Vanessa recovered faster than most people would have. That was one thing you could say about her. She never stayed embarrassed for long because she genuinely believed confidence could solve problems paperwork could not. She smoothed the front of her blazer, turned toward the gathering of homeowners, and clapped her hands together with the bright smile she'd worn throughout the entire marketing campaign. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced, this is simply a temporary administrative delay. Our attorneys handle these kinds of issues all the time. A few nervous laughs drifted through the crowd. Several residents nodded as though they wanted to believe her more than the sheriff standing 20 yards away. After all, many of them had already paid for premium boat slips, waterfront memberships, and summer event packages. Nobody enjoys discovering that a celebration might become a legal dispute. Vanessa walked confidently toward the stage where a giant rendering of the marina displayed luxury boats, evening concerts, and fireworks reflected across my lake. She picked up the microphone again. Everything you purchased remains protected, she continued. Silver Cove Estates owns all community waterfront improvements. We have every legal right to operate this marina. She emphasized the word own while looking directly at me. I simply stood beside the fence with my coffee, watching the morning breeze ripple across the water. The contractors exchanged uncertain glances but remained beside their equipment. Their foreman quietly checked his phone before walking over to Vanessa. I couldn't hear every word, but I noticed him pointing toward the deputies blocking the access road. He wasn't asking about construction anymore. He was asking whether they should leave. Vanessa shook her head almost immediately. "Nobody is leaving," she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. This project passed every inspection. Her certainty spread through the crowd again. Residents began reassuring one another that the sheriff would probably reopen everything within an hour. Some even started taking photographs in front of the closed entrance, laughing awkwardly as though the locked gate would eventually become a funny story they could tell at neighborhood barbecues. What they didn't realize was that Sheriff Mercer hadn't ordered anyone to leave because he wasn't finished yet. He was waiting for additional county officials to arrive. My attorney, Clara Bennett, remained beside the sheriff without saying much. That was another reason I trusted her. Good lawyers understand silence almost as well as judges do. She never argued with Vanessa. She never interrupted. She simply organized documents inside a leather binder while occasionally checking the time on her watch. The deputies continued redirecting vehicles away from the marina entrance. Every minute that passed cost someone money. Caterers waited beside refrigerated trucks. Musicians packed away instruments they had barely touched. A local television reporter quietly interviewed confused homeowners near the parking lot while cameras continued recording everything unfolding behind them. Vanessa still believed appearances mattered more than records. She thought if she projected enough confidence, the county would eventually step aside. She had spent months convincing everyone this marina represented the future of Silver Cove Estates. She had repeated that message so often she finally believed it herself. The strange thing about people who mistake authority for ownership is that they stop asking simple questions. Questions like who actually owned the shoreline, who controlled the access road, and why my attorney looked completely relaxed while everyone else's lawyers were suddenly returning phone calls. Those answers were already sitting inside Clara's binder. Vanessa just didn't know it yet. The first rail crack appeared so quietly that almost nobody noticed it. It wasn't an argument. It wasn't a raised voice. It was a construction foreman walking away from his crew with a folded site map tucked under one arm and an expression that had changed from confidence to concern. He stopped a few feet from Sheriff Mercer, removed his hard hat, and pointed toward the access road leading down to the marina. "Sheriff," he said carefully, "before we shut everything down, I need to confirm something. Our contract says this road belongs to the HOA. Sheriff Mercer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward Clara Bennett. My attorney opened her binder without a word and removed a laminated county survey map that looked older than half the houses surrounding the lake. She handed it to the foreman. The man studied it for several seconds before looking back toward the freshly paved entrance. His eyes narrowed. "That's impossible," he muttered. "We were never shown this version." Vanessa stepped forward almost instantly. "You don't need to review outdated surveys," she interrupted. "Our engineers completed new measurements before construction began." The foreman didn't respond right away. He simply compared the laminated map with the blueprints he had been carrying all morning. One of his supervisors joined him. Then another. Within moments, 3 contractors stood shoulder to shoulder tracing property lines with their fingers instead of preparing for a ribbon-cutting ceremony. That caught my attention because experienced contractors rarely stop working unless something on paper no longer matches what's in the ground. The deputies noticed it too. One of them quietly walked toward the road entrance where a weathered steel survey marker barely peeked above the edge of the new landscaping stones. Most people would have walked right past it without seeing anything unusual. He brushed away loose gravel with the toe of his boot until several stamped numbers became visible along the top of the marker. "Sheriff," the deputy called, "you may want to look at this." Vanessa laughed softly, almost dismissively. "That's probably an old boundary marker from before the subdivision existed." Her confidence never wavered. She spoke the way people do when they've repeated the same story often enough to mistake it for fact. Sheriff Mercer crouched beside the marker while the deputy photographed it from several angles. Clara remained exactly where she was, watching without offering a single explanation. She didn't have to. The survey marker was beginning to speak for itself. Around us, conversation slowed as more residents realized the ceremony wasn't restarting anytime soon. Caterers stopped unloading food. Musicians leaned against their equipment cases. Even the local reporter abandoned interviews with homeowners and walked toward the road carrying a camera over his shoulder. The atmosphere had changed. It no longer felt like a delayed celebration. It felt like people were watching the first pieces of a puzzle come apart. Vanessa folded her arms and turned toward me once again. "This changes nothing," she said confidently. "One old survey stake doesn't override years of community planning." I met her eyes for the first time that morning, but said nothing. There wasn't any reason to argue. Because the small piece of steel sticking out of the gravel wasn't the real problem. It was simply pointing towards something buried much deeper, something nobody working on that marina had bothered to verify before spending $3 million building on my lake. Vanessa glanced at the old survey marker one last time before giving a dismissive shake of her head. "That stake has been there for decades," she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "The county updates property records all the time. One rusty marker doesn't stop a $3 million development." Several homeowners nodded, relieved to hear an explanation that sounded simple. People usually prefer confidence over uncertainty, especially after spending money. The contractors, however, weren't nearly as comfortable anymore. Their foreman folded the county survey map and quietly walked toward Clara Bennett. He spoke in a voice too low for most of the crowd to hear, but I caught enough of it standing where I was. "Counselor," he asked, "is there another survey connected to this parcel?" Clara looked at him for a long moment before answering with a single sentence. "There are records your client should have requested before the first piling went into the lake." She offered nothing more. The foreman slowly nodded, and I watched the color drain from his face. That was the first moment someone outside the HOA realized this situation might be much larger than a boundary disagreement. Sheriff Mercer remained calm, as always. He instructed one deputy to continue documenting the survey marker while another deputy photographed the marina entrance, the floating docks, and every section of shoreline connected to the project. Nobody accused anyone of wrongdoing. Nobody made threats. They simply documented everything exactly as it existed that morning. Experience teaches law enforcement that photographs often become more valuable than opinions. Vanessa mistook that silence for hesitation. She stepped back onto the temporary stage, picked up the microphone once again, and smiled toward the residents gathered around the parking lot. "Friends," she announced, "this is nothing more than a paperwork review. We invested years planning this marina. We secured financing, engineering approvals, environmental reviews, and construction contracts. Does anyone honestly believe all of that could be stopped because of one outdated property map?" More applause followed. Not as much as before, but enough to reassure her that the audience was still with her. She smiled even wider. Confidence can become dangerous when it goes unchallenged for too long. I didn't interrupt. I had learned many years earlier that people reveal far more when they believe they're winning. My father used to tell me that arguments rarely expose the truth, but paperwork eventually does. Looking across the lake that morning, I thought about those words while sunlight reflected off dozens of brand-new boat slips that had never been used. Every cedar piling driven into the water represented another decision made without asking the simplest question imaginable. Who actually owned what lay beneath the surface? That question hadn't bothered Vanessa because she assumed the answer favored the HOA. She wasn't entirely wrong. Some of the shoreline did belong to the subdivision. Many permits had been properly issued. That was exactly what made the situation so dangerous. The marina wasn't built entirely on land the HOA didn't own. It depended on one overlooked detail buried inside old records. Hidden somewhere inside those old records was one overlooked detail that connected every permit, every contract, every membership, and every promise Vanessa had ever made to the community. She still believed the county was reviewing paperwork. She had no idea the paperwork was about to begin reviewing her. Standing beside the fence that morning, watching deputies photograph survey markers while homeowners whispered among themselves, I found myself looking past the marina toward the quiet stretch of shoreline where my family had spent nearly 70 years without anyone questioning who it belonged to. Funny how people only notice land after somebody decides it might be worth more than memories. My grandfather, Thomas Carter, bought this lake in 1958 after returning home from the Korean War. Back then, nobody called it waterfront property. It was simply 83 acres of timber, rocky shoreline, and a spring-fed lake tucked far enough away from town that most people thought he had wasted his savings. He disagreed. He believed peace was worth more than convenience. He built a small cedar cabin with his own hands, hauling lumber one truckload at a time because the nearest paved road ended nearly 4 miles away. My father grew up fishing from the same shoreline where the Marina docks now floated. He used to tell me that every sunrise looked different depending on the season, but the lake itself never changed. As a boy, I believed him because every Saturday morning we pushed an old aluminum fishing boat into the water before daylight, carrying nothing more than tackle boxes, sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, and a dented thermos filled with black coffee that I wasn't allowed to drink. We never caught many fish. That wasn't really the point. The lake was where conversations happened without needing many words. My father believed silence was something families should learn to appreciate before the rest of the world taught them to fear it. At the time, I thought he was talking about the lake. Years later, I realized he had been talking about much more than that. After I married my wife, Emily, the lake became part of our own routine. We built our own traditions there, returning every season until it felt less like property and more like part of the family. After Emily passed away following a long battle with cancer, I wasn't sure I would ever enjoy coming here again. For months, I came to the dock before sunrise with nothing but coffee and memories. The lake never asked questions. It never offered advice. It simply remained exactly as my grandfather had left it decades earlier. That's one reason I never considered selling, even after developers started offering numbers that would have sounded impossible when I was a child. Every few years, another developer arrived with glossy brochures promising to maximize the property's potential. My family had always measured value differently. We counted generations instead of profits. Looking back across the water that morning, I realized Vanessa had never understood any of that. To her, the lake was an opportunity waiting to be developed. To me, it was the last place where 3 generations of my family still felt present every time the wind moved across the water. That difference mattered far more than anyone standing in the parking lot realized. And it was exactly why I had spent months protecting documents instead of arguing with people. Because memories alone cannot stop construction. But sometimes, the paperwork left behind by the people who created those memories can. People often assume a piece of property matters because of what someone could build on it. Around here, that's usually the first question developers ask. How many homes fit along the shoreline? How many boat slips? How much annual revenue? My family never looked at the lake that way. We measured it differently. We measured it in mornings before the sun reached the water, in quiet dinners on the dock after long workdays, and in the simple comfort of knowing there was still one place where nothing had to be rushed. Even after my father passed, I kept the same habits he had taught me decades earlier. I still unlocked the old boathouse before sunrise. I still walked the shoreline with a cup of coffee while mist drifted across the surface. I still checked the weather by watching the tops of the pine trees instead of looking at my phone. Some traditions survive because they're useful. Others survive because they remind you who you are. Emily understood that better than anyone. She wasn't raised around ranches or lakes. She grew up outside Columbus in a neighborhood where backyards were separated by white fences and every house looked nearly the same. The first time I brought her here, she stood on the dock for almost 10 minutes without saying a word. Finally, she smiled and said, "I've never heard quiet sound this loud." I laughed because I knew exactly what she meant. The breeze moving through the pines, the splash of fish near the reeds, the creak of old cedar planks beneath your boots. None of it was silence exactly, but together it felt more peaceful than any place we'd ever lived. After we married, she planted blue flag irises along the eastern shoreline where the ground stayed damp through most of the year. Every spring those flowers returned without anyone asking them to. Even during the hardest months of her illness, she insisted on walking down to the dock whenever she felt strong enough. She'd sit on the last bench my father built and watch the water until the sun disappeared behind the western ridge. One evening, only a few months before she passed away, she reached over, squeezed my hand, and quietly said, "Promise me one thing. Don't let this place become something it was never meant to be." She wasn't talking about money. She wasn't talking about development. She was talking about the feeling the lake gave people who respected it. I promised her I would protect it. At the time, I assumed that meant refusing generous offers from developers. I had no idea that one day it would mean standing across the road from a $3 million marina built within sight of the very bench where we shared that conversation. Looking across the water now, I could still picture the shoreline before floating docks, steel pilings, and oversized welcome signs appeared. I remembered loons nesting near the reeds where rental boats were now tied. I remembered children catching bluegill from the old dock instead of crowds lining up for weekend boat rentals. That was why I never shouted at Vanessa. Anger wouldn't bring those mornings back. But protecting what legally belonged to my family still could. Most people standing in the marina parking lot believed this dispute was about ownership alone. They were wrong. Ownership was only the legal part of the story. The real reason I refused to walk away had been waiting on that shoreline for generations. And before long, something hidden inside the county records would prove that my promise to Emily wasn't the only one my family had managed to keep. Looking back, the first sign wasn't the marina itself. It wasn't the floating docks, the heavy equipment, or even the expensive marketing signs that eventually lined the entrance road. Those came much later. The first sign was so ordinary that almost anyone else would have ignored it. It happened nearly 11 months before opening day. On a cool October morning, while I was replacing weathered boards on the old dock my father had built more than 40 years earlier. The lake was unusually quiet that morning. A light layer of fog still floated above the water, and the only sound came from a pair of geese landing near the northern cove. Around 8 o'clock, I heard the distant hum of diesel engines climbing the county road. That wasn't unusual by itself. Utility crews occasionally worked nearby, especially after heavy storms. What caught my attention was where they stopped. Instead of parking along the public shoulder, 3 white pickup trucks pulled onto the gravel turnout beside my eastern shoreline. Men wearing reflective vests stepped out carrying tripods, measuring rods, and bright orange survey flags. They never crossed onto my property, but they spent nearly an hour looking across my lake instead of toward the subdivision under construction behind them. One of the surveyors occasionally pointed toward the shoreline, while another wrote notes on a clipboard. Before leaving, they drove several temporary stakes into the ground on the opposite side of the fence. I walked over after they left and noticed something strange. Every flag faced the water instead of the future neighborhood. That stayed with me. A few days later, I stopped by Miller's Feed and Hardware, the kind of place where local ranchers usually learn more over coffee than they ever could from county meetings. An old friend named Roy Jenkins looked up from the coffee pot and asked if I'd seen the new development plans. I told him I hadn't. He chuckled and said, "They're talking about building the biggest marina this county has ever seen." I remember laughing because the subdivision didn't even own enough shoreline to support a marina of that size. Roy shrugged. Maybe they know something we don't. That sentence followed me home. Over the next several weeks, more activity appeared near the subdivision entrance. Engineering trucks arrived. Environmental consultants walked the shoreline carrying tablets. Construction trailers were delivered. None of that violated my property, and none of it gave me any legal reason to interfere. People are free to develop land they own. My concern wasn't the construction itself. It was the confidence. Everyone involved behaved as though the project had already solved every ownership question before the first permit was ever requested. Then, one crisp November afternoon, I noticed something else. A temporary project sign had been installed beside the county road. Across the top, in large blue letters, it read, "Future home of Silver Cove Community Marina." Beneath the rendering, dozens of illustrated boats floated peacefully across a lake that looked remarkably familiar. Too familiar. The artist had even included the old pine-covered shoreline my family had owned for generations. That was the first moment I felt something wasn't merely optimistic. It was assuming rights that nobody had ever asked me about. I still didn't make a phone call. I still didn't confront anyone. Instead, I drove home, unlocked the old steel cabinet my father had kept since the 1960s, and pulled out a stack of county records that hadn't been opened in years. Something told me I was about to need every single page. The following morning, I loaded the old steel document box into my pickup and drove straight to the county recorder's office instead of the subdivision. There wasn't much point arguing with people who believed marketing brochures carried more authority than recorded deeds. Paperwork has a way of settling conversations without raising its voice. The recorder's office sat inside a brick courthouse that hadn't changed much since I was a teenager. The same worn marble floors, the same oak counters, the same shelves lined with property books dating back generations. Margaret Ellis, the deputy recorder, recognized me almost immediately. My father had known her father, And around here, those kinds of connections usually lasted longer than businesses or subdivisions. She smiled, poured herself another cup of coffee, and asked what had brought me in so early. I'd like every recorded deed, plat, easement, and chain of title document associated with Carter Lake, I said. She raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. 20 minutes later, the counter was covered with deeds, subdivision plats, tax maps, easement filings, shoreline surveys, and transfer records stretching back more than 60 years. Most people would have found the stack overwhelming. To me, it felt familiar. My father had taught me long ago that property ownership isn't protected by memory. It's protected by documentation. I spent nearly 3 hours comparing old survey maps with the newest subdivision plat. At first, everything appeared ordinary. Property lines matched. Parcel numbers lined up. Tax records were current. If I'd stopped there, I probably would have driven home believing the marina had simply been built very close to my shoreline. But county records reward patience. Around lunchtime, Margaret returned carrying another oversized map tube from the archive room. "You asked for everything," she said. "This predates the subdivision by almost 40 years. She carefully unrolled an original shoreline survey prepared when my grandfather purchased the property in 1958. The paper had yellowed with age, but the survey lines remained sharp. Every shoreline measurement had been hand-drawn. Every monument marker was labeled. Most importantly, the survey didn't stop at the water's edge. It extended into the lake itself. That caught my attention immediately. Modern subdivision plats often emphasize shoreline boundaries because most buyers cared about waterfront access. My grandfather's survey treated the lakebed as carefully as the surrounding land. I leaned closer, tracing the handwritten notes with my finger. Then I noticed something I hadn't seen on any of the newer documents. A bold notation identified a separate old parcel tied to the eastern cove, marked in a way none of the newer subdivision maps seemed to explain. I didn't say anything for several seconds. Margaret noticed my expression and quietly asked, "Find something?" I nodded slowly. Maybe. I wasn't ready to draw conclusions. Experience had taught me that one document alone rarely tells the entire story. I requested certified copies of the original deed, the shoreline survey, and every amendment connected to the property over the past 6 decades. Before leaving, I called Clara Bennett and asked if she had time that afternoon to review a few records with me. She answered on the second ring. "Did you finally find the survey?" she asked. I looked back at the rolled-up map resting on the courthouse counter. "I found one survey," I replied. "I'm beginning to think there may be another question nobody ever asked." Clara was quiet for a moment before speaking again. "Good," she said. "Keep looking. The first answer is almost never the one that changes everything. It's usually the second one." Clara arrived at my cabin just before sunset carrying nothing but a legal pad, a yellow highlighter, and the calm expression that had won more property disputes than dramatic courtroom speeches ever could. We spread the county records across my father's old oak dining table, the same table where 3 generations of my family had planned fence repairs, fishing trips, and cattle sales. Outside, the lake reflected the fading orange sky, while the unfinished marina stood silent across the eastern cove. Clara didn't begin with the newest documents. Instead, she reached for the oldest shoreline survey first. "Every mistake leaves a trail," she said quietly. "The trick is finding where someone stopped paying attention." For nearly 2 hours, we compared survey after survey, tracing boundary lines with rulers and matching parcel numbers against recorded deeds. Most of the documents repeated the same information with only minor updates over the years. Then Clara suddenly stopped moving her pencil. She leaned closer to one handwritten notation near the eastern shoreline and looked back at the modern subdivision plat. "That's interesting," she murmured. I stepped beside her chair. At first, I couldn't see what had caught her attention. The property lines looked almost identical. The shoreline measurements matched within inches. Even the monument markers carried the same identification numbers. Then she pointed toward a narrow strip extending beneath the water beside the marina docks. It wasn't large. In fact, most people would never have noticed it. "Do you see this parcel?" she asked. I nodded. "It appears on every original survey your grandfather recorded." She slid the modern plat beside it. "Now look here." The narrow submerged parcel wasn't identified the same way anymore. It hadn't disappeared completely. It had simply been treated as if it no longer required separate attention. Clara smiled, not because she had solved the case, but because she had found the first unanswered question. Someone assumed this area followed the shoreline transfer, she said. But assumptions don't rewrite recorded deeds. I felt my pulse quicken for the first time in weeks. Not because I believed we'd already won, but because the documents were finally asking the same questions I'd been asking myself since the survey crews first appeared. We spent another hour checking transfer records connected to neighboring parcels. Every shoreline sale had been properly recorded. Every subdivision boundary appeared legitimate. Yet that small submerged tract continued appearing under my family's ownership in older filings while receiving almost no attention in newer planning documents. Clara closed the final binder and leaned back in her chair. "This isn't enough to stop a Marina," she said carefully. "Not by itself." I appreciated her honesty. She never exaggerated evidence. But it's enough to justify asking a lot of uncomfortable questions. The next morning, I requested certified copies of every document connected specifically to that submerged parcel. Not just deeds, not just surveys. Every amendment, every permit reference, every engineering exhibit, and every recorded attachment filed over the past 60 years. If there was an explanation, I wanted it. If there wasn't, I wanted to know why. Looking across the lake before turning in for the night, I realized the floating docks themselves were no longer what interested me most. My attention had shifted beneath the waterline, toward a forgotten section of property that almost everyone seemed willing to overlook. Almost everyone except the one family that had owned it for generations. And something told me that hidden beneath those calm waters was only the first piece of a much larger mistake. I should have known Vanessa wouldn't slow down after we started asking questions. People who mistake confidence for authority rarely become cautious when challenged. They become louder. 3 days after Clara requested additional certified records from the county, a white envelope arrived in my mailbox by certified mail. Across the front, the return address read Silver Cove Estates Homeowners Association, Legal Affairs Division. Inside was a 12-page demand letter prepared by an outside law firm representing the HOA. According to the letter, my continued objections to the Marina project were interfering with a lawfully approved community improvement, damaging property values, and creating financial losses for the association. They demanded that I immediately stop contacting contractors, county employees, and surveyors regarding the Marina. They also warned that additional legal action would follow if I continued what they described as intentional disruption. I read the letter twice before setting it on the kitchen table beside my coffee. It contained plenty of confident language, but surprisingly few references to recorded property documents. Clara arrived that afternoon, scanned every page, and smiled the same quiet smile she always wore whenever someone spent more time making accusations than citing deeds. "Interesting," she said. "They talk a great deal about approvals. They barely mention ownership." The following week, the situation escalated again. Temporary fencing appeared across the gravel road leading toward the eastern shoreline. A large aluminum gate had been installed overnight with an electronic keypad mounted beside it. Above the entrance, a brand new sign read, "Authorized Silver Cove Marina Access Only. HOA Property. Residents and contractors only." I parked my truck on the county shoulder and looked at the sign for several moments. The road had never belonged to the subdivision as long as I'd known it. Yet there it stood, confidently announcing ownership to anyone driving past. Before I even stepped out of the truck, a private security guard approached carrying a clipboard. He remained polite. "Sir," he said, "I've been instructed not to allow unauthorized access beyond this point." I thanked him, turned around, and drove away without arguing. He was only following instructions. Besides, there was no benefit in debating with someone who had been handed incomplete information. Later that afternoon, Clara called. "They filed another complaint," she said. "This time they're asking the county to recognize you as interfering with an approved commercial project." I leaned back in my chair and looked toward the lake through the cabin window. "Did they attach anything new?" I asked. "Mostly engineering reports and HOA resolutions," she replied. "Still nothing that answers the ownership questions we've been asking." That wasn't all. Within another week, I received notice that the HOA intended to seek reimbursement for construction delays they claimed I had caused. Vanessa apparently believed that increasing financial pressure would convince me to walk away before the Marina officially opened. Instead of responding publicly, Clara filed formal requests for additional project documents, contractor submissions, permit exhibits, and supporting surveys referenced inside the HOA's own filings. Every request was perfectly routine. Every request required written responses. Every response added another piece to the growing paper trail. Meanwhile, construction continued. Decorative lights were installed along the docks. Landscaping crews planted ornamental trees beside the parking lot. Grand opening advertisements appeared in local newspapers announcing premium boat slips, waterfront dining, and exclusive membership benefits. Vanessa carried on exactly as though the marina's future had already been secured. Looking back, I realized her greatest mistake wasn't sending lawyers after me or placing gates across the road. It was believing paperwork only mattered when it supported her position. Every notice, every complaint, every new filing, and every additional signature was quietly building the record that would eventually matter far more than any speech she could deliver at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The second discovery didn't arrive in a dramatic courtroom or during some heated confrontation. It arrived inside a plain cardboard box delivered from the county planning office after Clara's public records requests were finally completed. The box contained permit applications, engineering exhibits, environmental correspondence, contractor submissions, marketing attachments, and hundreds of pages most people would never bother reading. Clara spread everything across her conference table the same way we had organized my family's old surveys weeks earlier. People usually hide mistakes in the paperwork they assume nobody will read, she said. We spent the better part of 2 days working through every page. Most of it confirmed exactly what we already knew. Construction schedules, utility plans, stormwater calculations, inspection reports. Nothing unexpected. Then Clara stopped at a promotional packet attached to one of the Marina financing documents. This wasn't filed for permitting, she said. It was submitted to support projected revenue. Inside were glossy brochures advertising Silver Cove Community Marina months before construction had even finished. The brochures offered annual memberships, reserved boat slips, weekend docking packages, fishing tournaments, private events, and waterfront gathering spaces. None of that surprised me. What caught my attention were the photographs and maps printed inside. Every highlighted recreation area extended well beyond the shoreline owned by the HOA. One aerial rendering outlined nearly the entire eastern cove as a community boating area. Clara reached for the original shoreline survey from 1958 and quietly placed it beside the brochure. The overlap wasn't subtle. Marketing materials presented areas as HOA amenities that the engineering documents never actually identified as HOA property. Interesting, Clara said softly. Their sales team appears more ambitious than their surveyors. That alone didn't prove intentional wrongdoing. Artists often exaggerate. Advertisers simplify. But then we found another attachment. This one listed premium memberships already reserved before opening day. Boat slip numbers, event reservations, private dock rentals, corporate gatherings, deposit schedules. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had already been committed based on representations made long before ownership questions were resolved. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the paperwork for several moments. They've already sold access, I said quietly. Clara nodded. They've sold something. The important question is exactly what they represented. They were selling. She highlighted several paragraphs without saying another word. Every highlighted sentence referred to exclusive access, protected waterfront amenities, private marina privileges, and permanent recreational facilities. None of those statements mentioned pending ownership questions or unresolved boundary issues. Clara closed the binder and looked at me. We're still missing one piece, she said. The documents show promises. The surveys raise questions. But we still need the county records that connect those promises to the actual property descriptions. I asked whether we should notify the HOA immediately. She shook her head. Not yet. Her answer surprised me. Why? She organized every document into separate folders before speaking again. Because people who believe they're already winning usually keep creating evidence. Every advertisement, every membership they sell, every reservation they accept adds another page to the record. Looking back now, I realized that was the moment the case quietly changed. It was no longer just about where floating docks had been installed. It had become about everything built on the assumption that nobody would ever compare marketing promises with recorded property documents. and Clara still believed the most important document hadn't surfaced yet. Once Clara finished organizing the files, everything became noticeably quieter. That surprised me at first because I expected letters, meetings, and more arguments. Instead, she advised exactly the opposite. No public statements, she said. No interviews. No confrontation. Let the paperwork travel. So that's exactly what we did. Certified copies of the original deeds, shoreline surveys, subdivision plats, permit filings, promotional materials, and supporting exhibits were assembled into separate binders. One set went to the county recorder for verification. Another was delivered to the planning department. A third was forwarded to the county attorney's office with a request for administrative review. None of the packages accused anyone of fraud. None demanded immediate enforcement. They simply asked county officials to determine whether the recorded property descriptions matched the representations supporting the Marina project. That distinction mattered. Facts travel farther than accusations. Within 2 weeks, the county began asking its own questions. Planning officials requested supplemental documentation from the HOA. Environmental staff asked for clarification regarding portions of the shoreline identified in earlier permit exhibits. Survey references were compared against archived records. Nobody announced an investigation. Nobody made headlines. The process unfolded quietly, exactly the way experienced public officials usually prefer. Meanwhile, Vanessa continued preparing for the grand opening as though nothing had changed. Invitations were mailed. Local businesses agreed to sponsor the ceremony. Caterers confirmed attendance. A Chamber of Commerce representative accepted an invitation to speak. Television crews were scheduled. Every new announcement convinced residents that the Marina's success was inevitable. Clara never criticized those preparations. She simply smiled each time another advertisement appeared. One afternoon, she placed a calendar on my kitchen table and circled a single date. "Don't expect anything before then," she said. It was opening day. "You're telling me the county already knows?" I asked. She nodded slightly. "They're reviewing records. But counties rarely interrupt projects halfway through unless public safety requires it. Administrative questions are usually addressed when officials have complete files." A few days later, Sheriff Mercer called me directly. His voice was as calm as ever. He didn't discuss legal conclusions. He didn't speculate. He only asked whether I would be available on the morning of the ribbon-cutting ceremony if county officials needed access to my property for documentation. "I'll be there," I answered. That was the entire conversation. No dramatic warning. No hidden strategy. Just a simple request. After hanging up, I walked down to the dock where the lake was perfectly still beneath the evening sky. Across the cove, workers installed the final decorative lights along the marina while banners advertising the grand opening fluttered in the breeze. Everything looked complete. Everything looked permanent. That's often the most dangerous moment in a property dispute. Not when construction begins, but when everyone believes the hard part is already over. Vanessa certainly believed it. She thought the silence meant the county had accepted her position. She never considered another possibility. Sometimes silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. Sometimes it means every piece has already been placed exactly where it needs to be, and all that's left is waiting for the right morning to let the record speak for itself. Opening day arrived exactly the way Vanessa had imagined it would. The parking lot filled before 8 o'clock. Luxury SUVs lined both sides of the entrance road. Caterers arranged breakfast tables beneath white tents while a local jazz trio played beside the ribbon stretched across the marina gate. Families carried folding chairs toward the waterfront. New members proudly clipped Silver Cove Marina badges onto their shirts. Television cameras pointed toward the stage where Vanessa stood smiling beside a polished podium decorated with blue and silver balloons. Looking around that morning, nobody would have guessed the most important part of the ceremony wasn't the ribbon waiting to be cut. It was the stack of county records resting inside Clara Bennett's leather briefcase. Sheriff Mercer arrived a few minutes before the scheduled opening, accompanied by 2 deputies, a county survey supervisor, and a representative from the planning department. None of them interrupted the event immediately. They simply walked toward the marina entrance with the same calm professionalism they had shown throughout the entire process. Vanessa greeted them with complete confidence. "Sheriff," she said cheerfully, "I'm glad you're here. I assume everything has been resolved." Sheriff Mercer removed a folded packet from the planning representative and opened it carefully. "Actually, ma'am," he replied. "The county has completed its review." The crowd became noticeably quieter. Clara stepped forward and handed the sheriff one additional certified binder. He nodded once before continuing. "The review confirms that Silver Cove Estates owns portions of the shoreline identified within the subdivision plat." Vanessa smiled immediately. She glanced toward the residents as though expecting applause. The sheriff wasn't finished. "However," he continued, "the review also confirms that ownership of shoreline improvements does not transfer ownership of separately deeded submerged property unless specifically conveyed by recorded instrument." The smile slowly disappeared from Vanessa's face. The county survey supervisor unrolled the original shoreline survey prepared in 1958 and placed it beside the certified subdivision plat. For the first time, both documents were displayed together where everyone could see them. The supervisor pointed toward the eastern cove beneath the marina. "This parcel," he explained calmly, "was separately described in the original deed recorded to Thomas Carter in 1958. Subsequent subdivision filings transferred adjacent shoreline, but did not include this submerged tract." Clara opened another certified document. "Nor was there any later recorded conveyance transferring ownership of the lakebed parcel, the private launch corridor serving it, or the access easement reserved within the Carter deed." The planning representative quietly added another sentence that changed the entire atmosphere. "Several permit applications appear to have relied upon ownership assumptions that are not supported by the recorded chain of title." Nobody spoke. Even the contractors stopped pretending this was only a delay. Sheriff Mercer looked directly at Vanessa before finishing the statement everyone had been waiting to hear. "Because the floating dock system, structural pilings, designated launch channel, and primary marina access depend upon property that remains under Mr. Carter's recorded ownership, the county cannot recognize the facility for public operation under its present approvals." I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The deeds, surveys, easement language, and 68 years of recorded county history had already spoken. The marina hadn't failed because of a technicality. It had failed because everyone involved assumed that building beside my lake somehow gave them the legal right to build upon the property beneath it. And that assumption had just unraveled in front of every resident, contractor, official, and camera gathered for the celebration. For a few seconds after Sheriff Mercer finished reading the county determination, nobody moved. The jazz trio stood frozen beside the stage. The ribbon fluttered gently in the breeze, still waiting to be cut. Coffee cups remained suspended halfway to people's mouths. It was the kind of silence that only arrives when an entire crowd realizes they have all been believing the same wrong story. Vanessa was the first to speak. "That's impossible," she said, forcing a smile that looked nothing like the one she had worn an hour earlier. She reached toward the survey maps spread across the registration table. "There has to be another document. There has to be an updated filing." The county survey supervisor calmly shook his head. "We've reviewed every recorded conveyance in the chain of title." Clara quietly placed one final certified index beside the original deed. "Every amendment, every plat, every easement, every recorded transfer." Vanessa flipped through page after page with growing urgency, searching for something that simply wasn't there. She looked toward the attorneys representing the HOA. Neither of them stepped forward. One slowly closed his briefcase. The other lowered his eyes to the ground. Sheriff Mercer gave a small nod to his deputies. Without raising their voices, they began closing the temporary barricades across the entrance road. One deputy removed the ceremonial ribbon from its posts before anyone could attempt the opening. Another walked to the marina gate carrying an official county notice while the planning representative completed the final administrative paperwork. Bright yellow postings were carefully attached to the entrance identifying the facility as closed pending compliance with county property determinations and applicable approvals. Nobody argued with the deputies. There was nothing left to argue. The documents had already answered the only question that mattered. Residents who had purchased annual memberships slowly gathered around the registration tables. At first, they asked polite questions. Then someone asked whether boat slip fees would be refunded. Another asked about prepaid event reservations. A third wanted to know why the promotional maps showed recreational areas that the county had just identified as property outside HOA ownership. The questions spread faster than the morning applause had. Volunteers working the welcome tent quietly stopped handing out membership packets. The local television reporter redirected his camera away from the stage and toward the growing crowd surrounding Vanessa. "Mrs. Holloway," he asked, when were residents informed that portions of the marina depended on property the association did not own? Vanessa opened her mouth, then stopped. She glanced toward her attorneys again. Neither answered. One simply whispered that they should avoid further public statements until they had reviewed the county findings. Around the parking lot, contractors began loading equipment back onto trailers. Decorative banners came down almost as quickly as they had gone up. Catering staff packed untouched food into insulated containers, while musicians quietly carried instruments toward their vans without ever playing another song. What had been planned as the community's biggest celebration quietly became its shortest event. Late that afternoon, another county vehicle arrived carrying additional administrative documents. Earlier that morning, a circuit judge had signed a temporary order preserving the disputed property interests while the remaining civil issues were resolved through the normal legal process. Sheriff Mercer accepted the paperwork, reviewed it briefly, and confirmed that the existing closure would remain in effect under county authority. No dramatic speeches followed. No one was placed in handcuffs. None were needed. The legal record had already accomplished what emotion never could. By then, homeowners weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at the HOA board members who had approved the project. Board members who had applauded every presentation now quietly slipped away one by one. Some avoided reporters. Others ignored questions from residents asking how millions of dollars had been invested without confirming the underlying property rights. Vanessa remained standing beside the empty stage long after most people had left. The balloons still drifted above the podium. The polished docks reflected perfectly across the water. Yet not a single boat entered the marina. Not a single membership card was used. Not a single ribbon was cut. I remained where I had stood all morning beside the old fence overlooking my family's lake. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile. I simply watched the water ripple beneath the afternoon sun, exactly as it had when my grandfather first bought this place in 1958. The lake had never needed defending with angry words. It had only needed someone willing to protect the truth recorded on paper long before anyone decided to build a $3 million marina on property they never actually owned. The lake felt different the following spring, not because the shoreline had changed, but because the noise was finally gone. The temporary barricades had long since disappeared, and so had the crowds, television trucks, and promotional banners that once promised luxury waterfront living. The floating docks remained secured under county supervision while the remaining legal issues worked their way through the normal civil process. Nobody rushed the outcome anymore. The loudest part of the dispute had ended the day the county records spoke for themselves. After that, everything became paperwork, exactly the way property disagreements should. Silver Cove Estates eventually announced a complete restructuring of its board. Several directors resigned within weeks of the failed opening ceremony, and new leadership informed residents that future projects would require independent title verification before any construction contracts were approved. Membership deposits were addressed through the association's insurance process, and negotiations with contractors followed their own separate path. I never celebrated any of that. Watching neighbors deal with disappointment wasn't something I enjoyed. Most of them had simply trusted the information they had been given. My disagreement had never been with families looking forward to weekends on the water. It had always been with the assumption that confidence could replace ownership. One quiet morning a few months later, Clara stopped by the cabin carrying a small envelope. Inside was a freshly recorded county certification confirming updates to the public property records following the administrative review. Nothing dramatic. No trophy. No grand declaration. Just another recorded document placed exactly where it belonged, preserving the same chain of title my grandfather had started decades earlier. Clara smiled as she handed it to me. "Sometimes the biggest victories are only a few pages long," she said. She was right. I placed the certification inside the same steel document cabinet my father had used throughout his life. The cabinet closed with the familiar click I had heard since childhood. Some people might have expected me to install larger gates, build higher fences, or place warning signs around every corner of the property. I did only one thing. Near the old boat launch my father built, I replaced a weathered wooden sign that time had nearly erased. The new sign looked almost identical to the original. It simply read, Carter Lake. Private property. Please respect the shoreline. Nothing more was necessary. Early the next morning, I carried a cup of coffee down to the dock before sunrise, just as I had done with my father years earlier, and just as I had done with Emily during quieter seasons of life. Mist drifted across the water while a pair of loons called somewhere beyond the eastern cove. The pine trees reflected perfectly across the calm surface, untouched by speeches, lawsuits, or expensive construction plans. Sitting on the old cedar bench where Emily once asked me to protect this place, I realized that promise had never been about winning an argument. It had been about making sure the next generation could stand on this same shoreline and feel exactly what my grandfather hoped his family would one day understand. Land isn't valuable because people fight over it. It's valuable because someone cared enough to protect it before anyone else realized what it was worth. The marina may have become the story people remembered, but that was never the ending that mattered most. The real ending was much quieter than that. The lake remained exactly where it had always been, waiting for another sunrise, another fishing trip, another family memory, and another generation willing to protect what paper, patience, and promises had preserved all along.